Okay, welcome everyone to the Package Group Architecture Forum for November the 27th, 2019. And leading off with Nick.
Hey everyone. So when I added this item to the agenda was completely empty. So this might be one for Think Big versus the architecture forum. But I'll voice it, and then if we want to discuss it, we can do. So the other day, I mean, it was yesterday, in fact, somebody posted on the front end Slack channel, IP, I think it was, his video about how they're using Renovate bot to manage or potentially manage the GitLab UI dependency in the GitLab code base itself. And what the video goes into detail is like basically how to set that up. And essentially what it does is it's just another CI job that gets run, and the bot gets run inside a Docker image, I believe. And what it does is it just checks your package JSON dependencies and works out whether or not any dependencies are, if there's any dependencies that require updating and all of this kind of stuff. And it already boasts like integration with GitLab. So what IP was using it for is that they were only using it for the GitLab dependencies, so for GitLab UI and like GitLab internal packages. And they weren't necessarily using it for all of the package JSON dependencies. So they like the rules that you can set up are quite good in the sense that you can just get it to track specific dependencies or specific packages. And it works across different package managers as well. So in this case, they were mostly using it for like GitLab UI in package JSON, but I think it does support Ruby gems as well. And I imagine other package registries as well. So obviously, whilst I was watching this video, I was just thinking this is all stuff that we should be looking at and how we can actually implement this inside GitLab itself. Now, that might be using the bot. We might like just want to bring it in a little bit further and make it like a first party, or we might want to do some like tighter integration. I especially took note that they were using the internal dependencies. So if GitLab UI, instead of being hosted on NPM, if that was hosted in the package registry, then like there's opportunity there for us to build something that would be like way tighter integration. And it struck me as well that this could be like a really good like MVC as well, like this particular use case. So if you're hosting a package on the GitLab registry, if you could somehow link that to a project, and then anytime that package is updated, that project receives a new MR or some kind of alert to say that this dependency is updated, because that's essentially what this Renovate bot was doing. So anytime it found a package that had a new dependency, it would it would create a MR inside the project and then basically just bump the number up in package JSON. That's, as far as I could tell, that's literally all it was doing. So on the surface, like to me, that doesn't sound like an insurmountable problem to solve. Like I feel like we've solved all the, or through the various proof of concepts I've done, I've sort of seen like ways that we could build this. Whether or not it would suit like match like usability things, I think we could get like a very minimal version of this running relatively quickly. Like my ideas is that we could have some kind of button or something on the package page where you could like link it to a project and say, look, this project wants to follow this package. And so whenever that package gets updated, it would know like which projects were following that package, and therefore it would then go and create an MR in that project. And I feel that that's not out of the realms of possibility. Like I feel that's achievable. But basically, yes, like in lieu of like any other agenda, the point was to sort of perhaps we should consider this and think up some ideas on how we could help the wider GitLab team with this problem that's like a real problem inside GitLab right now.
I'm kind of curious, how are like package updates managed within GitLab? Like I've seen merge requests that up gem versions and some other versions, and it certainly seems manual, but I'm not sure what actually like causes someone to say I'm going to update this gem or this npm package. Is anyone familiar with like what usually sort of sparks that?
I don't know outside of GitLab UI, so I don't know for general dependencies, but in GitLab UI, I've seen a few sort of like different approaches. One being that if I, as the engineer, make an update to GitLab UI, I would then go and create a second MR once it's been merged to update the dependency in GitLab itself. That's one approach that I've seen. I've also seen alternative approaches where GitLab UI has been updated, but the dependency hasn't been updated, and there appears to be some kind of consensus reached at a later point so that we're going to move to this version. I don't really know the rules that govern that though. So in short, I guess it's a mixed bag at this moment in time.
That agrees with what I've seen with the workhorse updates. I've seen when a workhorse version is updated, it generally goes into GitLab as either just its own MR, or if it was, there was a reason updated to support something within GitLab, it'll go in within that MR in GitLab as well. But yeah, generally very manual.
I've also heard too, this might be wrong, but I think IP would just periodically run Renovate bot like manually against the GitLab repo and then update our dependencies. So I think that's how the main GitLab repo updated its NPM dependencies at least.
Yeah, I definitely think that's the case because he's reached out to ask other people to do it occasionally. And so it's one of those things that nobody really jumps on.
So there's a perfect opportunity for automation, right? I think this process that Nick described, it will be very appreciated for big organizations which have security standards, and they will be able to say, if this package update, all the packages dependent from that update immediately, so we patch the security risk in a second, and be able to overview this kind of stuff and automate this with a couple of clicks will be very valuable, instead of reaching out to 20 package manager and say, hey, you need to update, you need to update, you need to update.
As a side note, I don't know if we could ever ship Renovate bot with GitLab. It is open source and it has a AGPL v3 license. I don't know if that's compatible with us, but it could be, instead of building our own version of Renovate bot, it'd be interesting just to ship their version. Something to consider.
Yeah, I definitely think that's worth looking into. One of the things that was interesting in the video is how it is a little bit incompatible with how we work. So I think as part of the configuration that you set with Renovate bot is you can only set one particular reviewer, or so you can only assign the issue to one particular person. And that was pretty hard to configure between like a backend dependency versus a NPM dependency, which in the case of GitLab would be two completely different sets of maintainers. So I don't think, so even if we were going to bring Renovate bot in, there would be some workflow we'd either have to build into Renovate bot or around it to support like GitLab's particular workflow.
I'm just opening an issue for it now. And there's a separate issue here where the security team is working on auto remediation of packages as well. So I feel like between Renovate bot and this issue I just linked, we have the mechanics and the plumbing, so to speak. So I would love to add this feature. It sounds awesome. And it looks like Renovate supports Docker and PHP and other languages too, but NPM could be a good place to start since we are dogfooding it.
Tim, what overlap do you see between what security's got down for auto remediation of security issues in packages and what this looks like?
Well, just in the sense that they're making updates when there's a security or vulnerability fix. So just like the mechanics of opening an NMR. Let's see. So they have change log, merge request. So a merge request gets submitted automatically when there's an update. So we would do something similar for updates to NPM packages, but not exactly the same, I guess, for Renovate.
Yeah, this looks like a pretty cool feature. I wonder whether there's some overlap with release and or verify as well. And I'm not saying that for any other reason other than that we might actually get some extra help for doing stuff like this when it like overlaps with other teams and it looks like an awesome idea, which it does. So it might be worth like evaluating that as well.
Release would be interested in like any sort of evidence of a release. So like if something they're interested in like knowing that this is an approved version of the package or this is what shipped with a given release, but I don't know if they would necessarily be interested in like the auto updating portion of it. But there might be something for verify that we could put into the YAML file to say like to add in this command, like a renovate command that would say like auto update this package or something like that.
Well, and the package auto update situation is something to keep in mind, is that we've had the hijacking of totally valid packages into not totally valid packages. So I don't know how you sort of avoid that. Obviously, like that's not, just kind of have to know, but that's one thing to keep in mind as well.
Could we do a first step in this direction for this feature by adding like a webhook that gets called by our system every time a package is updated, and this would help like us build up a bot that actually go and update the packages, and maybe people that want to connect a third service to connect it to that, or like develop it with local API or with some sort of every kind of stuff, and it can be a first iteration step.
What's the difference between doing a webhook specifically versus just like a I don't know, a curl command or something on a CI pipeline? Would that not work as well?
I think it will work. Maybe there is a difference in speed. The webhook can be called like more live, but yeah.
I think that's an interesting idea, actually. I was just wondering if if you could get around it with curl right now, just to, I don't know, get something moving quickly.
I think that how Renovate bot works currently is that it ties into our push webhook. So we do already have that one, but that doesn't invalidate the need for a package specific webhook. That'd be cool too.
Cool. All right, so we're building an issue out, and Nick, do you feel like this is a good way to sort of express a first step for you for the idea that you've had?
Yeah, absolutely. It's in line with how I've done it with other ideas. So if I put an issue together, I'll ping the team, and people, if they have feedback, feel free to jump in, and hopefully we can move it forward somehow.
I think Tim already started making one. Am I right there, Tim?
Ooh, sorry.
Yeah, but I mean, I just put in like a couple sentences, so I think.
No, that's great. No, I didn't mean to say, well, the Tim's
Yeah.
taking it. I just meant to say, like, he's already got the like framework there for you to go use. So you've got one. Awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you, Tim.
no problem.
Yeah, and peeps, like, if no one has had any other comments, the awkward silence means it's probably time to move on to the next item in the agenda.
Cool, that's me. So one of the things that's kind of just been in the back of my mind is how are we going to implement the dependency proxy for the package registry? And so right now, the container registry is just pretty much using Docker registry to pull the images from outside sources and store them in our own environment. So the way that things currently sit, there is no support for packages, and there's no way to use it to support packages. So I'm curious if anyone, has thought about this and had any ideas of how we might be able to sort of implement it. And I know this is sort of like a large problem, and I don't expect anyone to have like, oh, this is the idea that will work today. But even if it's just, this kind of gets it on people's minds and we can revisit it another week, that would be enough. But if anyone had any thoughts, that would be pretty cool.
Yeah, I think this has been something we've talked about a few times. I don't feel like I'm the information owner here or anything like that, but just to maybe get people's thoughts going. What's really interesting about the dependency proxies, at some level, it's implemented the API for the container registry so that it can act like a container registry. And so it sort of looks like a container registry right now, but what we're saying is it might end up looking like all of the things, so that it could act like a proxy effectively. And there's a bunch of other ideas we've had around that sort of concept of like, well, maybe we could use that as a way to just, reference external repositories that people might want to use for whatever it is. But I think technically it's a super interesting thing to think about, because if it's just implementing everything, our dependency proxy, or acting like these APIs, our dependency proxy becomes like the Babel fish. That'd be a good code name if we used code names. But anyway, as it translates between all these different APIs to access whatever blob someone's trying to get or package someone's trying to get. But the technical of like, okay, well, but how do we do that then? What does that even look like? It's like a pretty fun challenge. I think it's really interesting. What do you think? What do you think is a good way to start, Steve?
I was asking everyone else what a good way to start was. No,
a good way to start is to ask everyone else a good way to start.
I haven't had any specific ideas. I mean, I've been slowly learning like how we use object storage for storing packages and kind of understanding, how the whole workflow works with Workhorse. And so, like, I'm thinking certainly the proxy is going to be coming like through that system. But as for how we connect to different services that are outside of GitLab, I think that's kind of one of the bigger challenges.
What if, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go.
Oh, I was gonna say right now the dependency proxy is set up to cache images. What if we simplified it by saying it's not caching anything? It's just serving as a reverse proxy. So it's just taking the requests from NPM or Maven Central, and it's not doing any of the caching. Would that simplify the implementation at all?
Sorry, I don't know if I got. Can you rephrase that?
I think right now the dependency proxy is serving as both a proxy and a cache for Docker Hub, and so I suspect that the caching involves some additional complexity. So what if we said, okay, for an initial integration, don't worry about caching anything from NPM, just worry about proxying the requests and serving the, not caching.
I do think that's a good way to start, by breaking it into those two pieces. Like, I think the overall like value is that eventually things will be cached, so it speeds things up. But just connecting to the services to begin with is probably certainly the first step that needs to happen. So that would make sense. I'm not sure if it really simplifies what needs to be done with regards to connecting to those services. I haven't really thought about that.
Another idea that a user brought up recently with me was just mirroring anything that from you could mirror everything from NuGet, or you could mirror everything from NPM. And so what if we mirrored everything, and then we could just proxy those requests? So it would be, instead of worrying about all of the different commands, we would just be basically just proxying a feed from NPM or NuGet or something like that.
Yeah, I bet that would definitely work for like an open source, for all the open source packages. I think the tricky part we'll get into when we have like people that want to proxy their private packages from external places, which I don't know if that's like, that could be its own separate iteration further down the road. We start out with, here are all of your public packages and dependencies you're using. And then if you want to use your private dependencies that are from external places, that's a different story because it's a bit more complicated.
Regarding caching packages, do we know already if we have limitation on the various package manager API with timeouts? So my example is if package manager requests for dependency proxies for package that we don't have locally, we go to the registry, fetch it, cache it, and serve it back, or we need to connect them to the registry so that they can download their packages and store somewhere on a list like, I need to download this package and cache it. So next request can be to our server, because this can change a bit the architecture of how we do stuff. Because maybe an initial trade-off of one first slow request, if there is no timeout in the package manager, can simplify greatly the implementation instead of saving what needs to be cached later on.
I don't think I fully understood the question, but I don't know if I was supposed to.
I'll try to. Yeah, I'll try to reformulate. So when the moment that we want to cache the package to actually speed up pipelines or like consuming the packages, wherever our request for a package that is not yet cached in our registry arrive, we need to know if every package manager has a timeout, for example, to receive the first stack, because there are two types of caching that we can go through. We either immediately connect them to the original registry and give them the feed so they can download, and then we start saving that package in our own registry separately, or we go to that registry, load it ourselves, and then serve it back. And this is like two types of implementation we can have, but it depends if the package manager allow us to like initial slow response, for example.
That makes sense now. Maybe a good first step would just be to like draw how it could work. That could be like a good first step of like how would it connect to NPM, Maven, NuGet, Conan, and Docker. And then like what does that drawing look like? It might help clarify some of our thinking about how it could function.
It might not be a good idea to do a lot of things inside the request made by a package manager. Otherwise, yeah, you have, I guess you have timeouts, but you are dependent on the final registry, which might be slow or which might be not available. So I guess it would be wiser to go with your first solution, Nico, where you just proxy the request, but at the same time you just queue a background job or whatever, saying, okay, we have made a request for this package, just cache it for us now.
Yeah, it's probably safer.
One other thing about private packages, we could have different registries that we proxy, and each registry could have its own configuration about how do you connect. Like if you connect to npmjs.org, you don't need any kind of authentication, but if you connect to your own private npm registry, you will need this user and this token, so that when you hit the package proxy, he will know, okay, I have to try to hit this private registry. Here are the credentials. I can use them to connect to it.
Yeah, I'm betting a first step from that aspect is each of the package managers, I believe, generally has a single main public registry. So the first step could be connect to those without any authentication. And then the next step would be identify, what are the private registries that people are using. If it's all Artifactory or JFrog or something, then we could prioritize which ones we work with to authenticate against in that order.
Yeah, I guess the very first step would be to connect to our package proxy, which will just proxy the public registry, and that's it. And from there, we can work on iterations, adding the ability to add more registries to the proxy, and how do you connect to these registries. But that's more future versions than the first one.
I have a question for Steve. Do you think we can recycle the whole API part of the package manager implementation for the proxy and just change how the storage under the API works?
I think we could definitely utilize a good portion of some of the API logic. I'd have to look at, I'm not sure if it would be like exactly as written, but we might be able to extract out like how certain aspects are working. But yeah, I do think we'd be able to recycle some of that code.
Because it's similar to the model where you can sometimes define that a model, it's like that you use as a data source, can be a DB or can be another API, right? It will be the same philosophy, and we could like recycle all that kind of principles.
Yeah, definitely.
So one of the ideas I think that may be worth thinking about here is if the idea in that model, Nico, is to change out the underlying storage architecture, and that can be pretty pluggable. If you build it that way, it's actually not too big a deal to do that, depending on how it's all architected. If we are using that model, then the proxy as an independent thing, is that really necessary at that point? Like this is the dependency proxy, here's its own paths, here's its own API endpoints. If we're proxying and then caching behind the scenes in the current implementation of the API as it stands, do we need to make any changes at all but to change the storage, the way the architecture is working, where the requests go, right? So like, and the model here would be, I currently have an instance of NPM registry or repository, and then I add proxying to that. It just happens magically in the background, because instead of going off to our instance, it also go off to the NPM instance and pull that down, as opposed to having a separate instance that's a proxy. But what's interesting about that, I think, from an architectural standpoint, that we could discuss, and I'm curious to see what people think, because that's why I'm raising it. What's interesting about that idea is like, where we're putting energy, and we don't have to have the dependency proxy act like everything if we intercept the storage requests and figure out how to get them, right? And that speaks to what you're talking about before, of whether you do a separate download to cache and all that sort of stuff, right?
So here's a question. In regards to caching the files, so when you're running a pipeline, I think you can, if you do something like an npm install or something on the first job, and that installs a node modules folder, I think you can persist that between jobs, like that gets cached. I think, like, I don't actually know the mechanics of it, but is that something that we could leverage? Because obviously those files must exist somewhere. So is that a mechanism that we could take a look at and see if such a thing is suitable for caching of files in the dependency proxy?
I think for NPM, yeah. I mean, I know that, I don't know if many of the other package managers follow that same convention of like, store all of the packages within the project folder pretty much. And I'm also kind of wondering, once you have, does the node modules folder have information about like the package, like metadata, like versioning and all of that kind of stuff, or is it really like just the actual fully built packages?
Pass. I don't know. I don't think so. I think it's just like package JSON and package lock JSON. But what I was getting at there, actually, I don't know if I'm wording this correctly. What I was getting at is that there's some kind of mechanism on GitLab itself that allows you to cache these files between CI jobs. I think, like, I don't know for sure, but so I just wondered if whatever that mechanism is, if that's writing some files to like a disk and then downloading it onto a Docker image or whatever it might be doing, I wonder if that's something that we could leverage.
Yeah, I guess I don't know.
I think for npm itself, or like the front end modules, either npm or yarn, I guess the node module folder, it's a unique representation of all your dependency and children dependencies. So if you cache it at once, it may not be that much efficient, or better, you can only have just pieces. It will work again for that exact package.json plus log file. Not, it wouldn't be like spreadable across multiple pipeline, multiple project that way.
All right, that feels like an awkward silence to me. I don't know if people have other thoughts, but we should try to tune ourselves to awkward silences to make sure that we're moving on to the next thing.
Sorry, Dan, is there an action item from this one? Like, is there something that we can take forward?
I can add some notes in terms of, we kind of came up with a few steps of, like we might want to implement one thing first and another thing second, and sort of that order of initial iterations. And I can add those notes to the existing issues concerning the package proxy. Next.
I was thinking about the package list and the package details, and the fact that depending if a package is coming from our pipeline, if it's attached to the current project, or if the package is an npm package, maybe a NuGet, we have a set of common detail and then a lot of specific detail that we will need to dynamically pull in the UI. And this is basically why GraphQL is useful. And I think it's best that we start to think in advance if we can adopt it, if we can use it, because I'm quite sure that at some point we will be asked, like, why are we not building this API in GraphQL if we decide not to go? So we better either go with that or have a good answer why we are not going with that, because that's exactly the use case. Plus, it's the push to actually write new stuff in GraphQL. So we will need to face this sooner or later. And I think better discuss it sooner so we can move in a more structured direction. Any thoughts?
I'm all for it. I mean, I'm familiar with, what GraphQL offers, and it definitely seems like a good fit for it.
I think it's a good idea, but since GraphQL is pretty much back-end led at this moment in time, and like, I don't know, we're quite strapped for resources on the back end already. Like, how are we going to first like do our existing back-end work that we've planned in, and potentially also do that in GraphQL at the same time? Like, do we switch and only implement a GraphQL version, or do we still need to maintain and build non-GraphQL endpoints? I don't really know the distinction or any of that kind of thing, but I'm just thinking that it's probably like quite resource intensive to add GraphQL endpoints for every piece of data.
I'm thinking, so, and correct me if I'm wrong, other people that have been working in the back end. So we certainly still need API, like standard API endpoints to deal with the package manager clients because they're just making REST requests. But all of the internal sort of like model view controller type stuff could probably be done in GraphQL. And with that regards, there's really only a few models that need to be migrated over to that GraphQL format, I think, in order to sort of start making that happen.
What do you think if we reach out to the team that are doing this on daily basis and ask for a sync meeting or to open an issue and ask them to chime in and like pointers, where to start, what model could look better to address this, and maybe we can do the same thing on the front end side, like get a quick workshop from somebody else in the other team, like what best practice, what you should be careful of, and similar stuff. I don't know if this is a practice inside GitLab, but it makes sense to me because there is this expertise inside.
Do we know which teams are actually using it already?
I think on the web, the design tab is made with GraphQL and probably the web editor, but on that I'm not sure.
I do know that when you go to create an issue and you type in the title and it drops down those related issues, that's a GraphQL endpoint it's hitting. So I think that would be create, I think is issue. So they might be a good people to talk to.
What about the public GraphQL API? Should we add packages, methods, or endpoints to it?
I think it will make sense to start internal, see how comfortable we are, and then expose it if we think, and so that the public API can be only one, right? Instead of maintaining two.
Yeah, it should be, well, that's the ideal. One API for UI and the public one, but yeah, I guess you're right. It's better to start internal first.
I'm not actually sure do we have an internal GraphQL endpoint, or I thought we just had the one and it's public, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, maybe we just don't document it. We just silently ship it.
Do you know if there are any issues sort of looking at this at all? Generally, this is, in my head, it seems like an engineering effort on our part to sort of come up with this. Nope. So we need to figure out if there's an existing effort or a mention of this. It seems like, Steve, you had an idea there where we could potentially implement something and then convert, right, on certain models. You mentioned that before. Do you want to create an issue on that? Do you want some help?
Yeah, I can create an issue. I feel like I may or may not understand what I'm talking about, but I can I can start it and people can comment and we can sort of move forward with it.
Yeah, the default should be to like describe this sort of stuff in an issue. I mean, if you just interested, I think, in learning about how people are implementing. I think there's some, maybe plan or create is the team that probably has experience. We can figure that out. So that step would be go figure out which teams are actually using it, and then sort of get someone to chat with about it and see how they've done it and get a better understanding. There's a reference here for howtographql.com, which is mostly just saying for the peeps following along at home. So yeah, first steps might be to get a bit more education, but I would always want to capture this in an issue, like just go, hey, maybe we should do this. And you don't have to really understand it because you've sort of described what you think might be helpful, right?
Cool. Yeah, I'll create an issue and post it in the public channel.
There is also a GraphQL Slack channel. I think it's F_GraphQL. Just an FYI.
Okay, that got pretty awkwardly silent. It's excellent. So I think we can move on from there.
Okay. So I think I'm next. So there's the discussion on a potential online garbage collection solution that was recently brought up. And I put a link in the document, and it'd just be nice to have some eyes on this, sanity checking, that kind of thing. The essential design is that we'd have a proxy that sits in front of the registry that would intercept requests and log manifests and blobs and be able to coordinate those in a way that is more reliable than the file system can, just because of the read after write consistency problems. One of the benefits of this is that we'd either be able to drop the fork of the Docker registry, or more likely rely on it a bit less, and so that we would not have to make as big of changes that are harder to manage with upstream changes. Yeah, so just some ideas on that, questions, comments, concerns, that kind of thing. I think it's a really neat idea.
Question. This will also solve all our API performance issues, right? Because we wouldn't need to traverse to the registry anymore. We could eat just our DB, which is proxying everything. Am I correct?
Yeah, potentially. I think it would end up at a pretty, it starts with nothing, obviously. So my idea would be for stuff it doesn't have, it pushes through to the registry. So for stuff that hasn't been hit yet, it's essentially a cache miss. But for stuff that's been accessed before, you are just hitting that database, and the performance should be quite a bit better. And this would also allow us to, we have an issue with home charts that don't have a created field. So we could potentially think about what's a general OCI image that we can like an idea of an OCI image that we can rely on. It says like, we're gonna record this metadata every time, regardless of what media type it is. And then we could rely on that in Rails in a way that we can't with the different media types like Docker images and Helm charts, if that makes sense. Like we could have something that's a little more consistent for stuff that we want to record.
This
So,
sounds
go
sorry.
ahead.
this sounds really similar to the issues I saw about proxying the container registry with Rails. So it seems really similar.
I'm not, is there a link you can provide for that discussion?
Yeah, that was actually in the determining the direction of the future direction of the container registry issue. There was a big discussion around whether we would go and effectively build our own using Rails and Workhorse, or we would invest into the container registry implementation that we already had, which is Docker Distribution Registry. There was a lot of debate in that issue, which I can find and add to the agenda doc. And I found it already. Excellent. Yeah, so I was actually going to say the same thing, David. So the thing to be, I think what I'd be interested in here is like the endpoint of this logic. We have the dependency proxy, which is currently designed to proxy requests and cache, and requests through to the container registry. The idea that is described much better in the issue I shared here is the idea there is to basically the idea was to take that solution, expand it, because we're already implementing some elements of the API that the container registry has. And so why not just expand it and make that the thing we use instead of being dependent on the external solution that we have limited influence over, which was the case with an external project that we were trying to get stuff merged into, and it was clear there was sort of like not things moving in the Docker Distribution Registry repository. The basic feeling was we could do that, but when we're developing a solution from scratch, and in developing a solution from scratch, we lose all of the built up sort of trial and error, fail and success, that's been invested into the Docker Distribution Registry. So I guess my question would be, and maybe there's not an answer for this necessarily, but maybe the question is, what's the endpoint of this? I can see the reverse proxy being a way to migrate to a different solution, but and that sounds like actually a really cool idea, but then implementing it ourselves, are we just going to end up with something in Rails, which we may have scaling concerns over, and distribute it into Workhorse, which we wouldn't. And as such, we're just building our own on top of, and rather than using the Docker Distribution Registry and that code base. That's kind of the open question, I think.
Yeah, the original suggester of this solution mentioned the Strangler Pattern, which is a Martin Fowler thing where you build a system that intercepts messages to an older system, and then you build out functionality in the new system gradually over the course of a few years as you need it. And the old system is replaced, kind of piece by piece. I'm not sure if the endpoint is that this reverse proxy stays like as lean as possible, and we rely on the existing distribution where we can, or if we do eventually just replace it over the next 5, 6, 7 years. That is still an open question, but that's sort of the that was the intent, I think, of the original suggestion of this thing, was to replace the registry in this fashion.
Yeah, and I think the other competing idea there was like what we've spec'd out based on this issue. And you sort of are the person we hired to help execute on that, Haley. So I think you're the expert, or becoming the expert as you learn. So I don't think we should ever be afraid to reevaluate decisions we've made. We should always check to see whether they're still in line with our goals and our capabilities. But I would say I can see that there's two options or several options here. The continuum, right, of saying, okay, we can go from we can implement this in order to switch. That gives us a great way to switch, but that doesn't mean we actually because in theory, if you disconnect from the potential solution, right, of being like we built our own thing, we could be saying, well, let's use Harbor instead or something like that as our container registry, and we could use this pattern to do that switch and make it relatively seamless for our customers, or whatever we implemented ourselves. So I think there's definitely worthwhile discussion there. Yeah. Have you chatted with Grzegorz at all, Haley?
Just on the issue, just back and forth under that post.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, if you feel like it's useful, you could definitely set up a sync with Grzegorz, and if you scan through that issue that I shared in the agenda, you'll see that Stan, Marin, DZ, Grzegorz, and Camille all had some pretty interesting thoughts on how we might go about implementing effectively online garbage collection. Was really the core of the issue we were trying to solve there, I think.
If we were to kind of go down this route, because like there's the note that we wouldn't need our own registry then, or our own fork, I suppose. But wouldn't we still have the problem of like certain aspects of the registry are slow, like that whole, like we deal with like the bulk API delete is a very slow process to go through and delete tags. That's something that wouldn't be fixed or affected by this at all. Am I correct in saying that?
Probably. It's hard to say. I mean, it's potentially, the first thing that comes up in my mind is we could talk to the proxy, and it could, super quickly record the job it needs to do, and then asynchronously take care of the deletion so that it's fast to the caller, even though the job itself takes time. I think that is a good thing, that there are issues with the registry. There's things the registry does we'd like to be different. So I think the general problem with online garbage collection, I think, should probably require a database. It doesn't necessarily need to live in a reverse proxy, though. It could be something that's just part of the container, or runs the registry itself, calls the database. So the reverse proxy might just be not part of the solution, and eventually the database is just a part of the registry itself, part of our fork.
So another question in that line. So Nico asked about how this might solve API performance, about potentially grabbing data from images. This really doesn't solve that at all, does it? At least unless I'm misunderstanding, because if the database starts with no data and is only getting populated as and when images are being pulled or used, then that means you're still going to have to check not just the database, but the final destination as well, like the registry, for things like metadata. Is that right?
At first, yeah. And I think, essentially it's a cache miss until it's populated. I think right now the focus on what it can do has basically been like, how do we do online garbage collection? And that's kind of the primary thing, rather than, and the other issues are kind of secondary right now. Right. But
okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And I think the other thing here is, at least, I don't know if I sort of communicated it very well, but the idea could be like, if you get a request, you just use that opportunity. And I think I'm just paraphrasing what Grzegorz said in the issue. you use that request to populate the new solution that you're going to be using. New solution, whatever it ends up being, a proxy of some kind, some other implementation, whatever it is. And then you basically use that. It would be a cache miss effectively, because it would go look in the new fast way, and then it would go check the old, the implementation we have, migrate that database, or excuse me, that container or the image over to the new solution in the back end. And then from then on, you have a cache hit in our old system, and then you can delete the other stuff out. It could be used, this model could be used as a migration strategy to a different solution, whether that's, you know, workhorse, reverse proxy, like some Rails implementation / Rails Go implementation of what we wanted to build in future or not. That's kind of, I think, another way to look at this as well, as being like, oh, it's temporary. Yeah, for sure, you get a cache miss, as Haley mentioned, and you'd end up having a long running request or a longer request. You'd still have API issues, but from then on, not only do we have a cache hit, but we also then can migrate those customers over as we've automatically pulled their images and blobs into the new system. It doesn't act like a proxy, it acts like a permanent move mechanism type thing, although it basically is a proxy. Proxy cache, sorry. Sounds like Docker distribute. It sounds like dependency proxy, doesn't it? Which is why that whole conversation started of being like, well, why don't we just use this, put everything in our own system. So definitely, if for people that are interested, and we like totally at time, but if people are interested, go read through the issue I shared, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts. This is one of my most uncomfortable decisions I had to make as an early stage team with no engineers in it, really, of being like, oh, which direction we should go, or should we go, and having basically two camps that were competing on whether they felt like one thing was right or wrong. And so I kind of ended up going, well, I don't have anyone that can own this decision right now anyway, so I think we should do this way because this feels like a way forward. I'm happy to reverse that if we don't feel like that's a good solution, by the way. And it wouldn't be me reversing it. I will support the decision that's made by the experts that we have. This is a great question, Haley. Thanks for bringing this up.
Yeah, and I think just a function of me being new is I'm gonna retread some ground unknowingly. So I do appreciate having, getting not called out, but getting like reminded of that and having that link so I can go and recheck. So I do appreciate that.
Oh, no worries. And this is part of the learning process. You're asking all the right questions, and you shouldn't feel like there's a bad question to ask here. They're all great questions. One thing I did want to mention really quick, because I think we'll have to drop here, is the real problem we're trying to solve is unbounded growth of the container registry. So we currently are operating a ridiculously large number of, megabytes, gigabytes. Actually, it's in the petabytes now. So that's genuinely what the issue we're trying to solve is. Because we don't have online garbage collection, we'd have to be offline for weeks to clean it up. Even to clean up the stuff that's untagged and then figure out what actual storage is. That's the key issue we're trying to solve. And so online garbage collection felt like the way to solve that issue. Performance of the offline garbage collection for some of our larger customers is a huge issue that needs to be solved. So just wanted to make sure we were clear on that main goal. Does anyone have any other comments they want to make? Cool. This is awesome. Thank you, everyone. Hope everyone has a good rest of their day.
Thanks. See you later.